Hi, I'm Mike Beliveau, and today I want to talk about the guns used by the Texas Rangers in the 19th century. Now this is going to be a two-part series, and the first video, which we'll do right now, is going to cover the period of 1823 to 1870. Then we'll pick up the second video, we'll pick up from 1870 until 1900. So let's get started. You know, the term Texas Rangers was first used in kind of a quasi-official document, a handwritten document from Stephen Austin in 1823. And it said, "I shall employ 10 men to act as rangers for the common good." And from that humble beginning, the Texas Rangers have sprung, and they are still one of the premier law enforcement organizations in the country today, in the world possibly. Now, for the first 50 years of their career, the Texas Rangers was primarily a paramilitary force whose mission was to protect the frontiers of Texas from Indian depredations. And only gradually did that grow into becoming primarily a law enforcement role as the Indian threat faded away. So let's take a look at those first 50 years. Well, in the 1820s, the Rangers were pretty much an ad hoc organization. When a threat appeared, the men who had volunteered for ranger duty would assemble and generally chase the bad guys. And they used their personal firearms. So they would have been using flintlock rifles, flintlock shotguns, flintlock pistols. And in fact, these would have been very similar, if not the same guns, used by their fathers at the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, and used by their grandfathers in the Revolutionary War. And not much of a change. Now, at this time, the percussion lock system was just getting started, and it had not permeated very well to the frontier. And actually, it wasn't well trusted on the frontier yet, and you can't blame them. If your life's going to depend on your gun, you want to depend on a gun that you know, that you feel confident in. So they often arm themselves with flintlock rifles just like these. But as we got into the 1830s, the percussion system became more popular and really became the predominant system on the frontier, and the single-shot rifles used by the Texas Rangers would have become percussion guns for the most part in the late 1830s and into the 1840s and right through the 1860s. In addition to flintlock rifles, most Rangers of the time would have armed themselves with a pair of single-shot pistols and with a Bowie knife. And, the reason for that is pretty simple. One shot and these are empty. This is never empty. So, after you've taken your shot and the Indians are swarming over you, you need a sharp, pointy thing to keep them at arm's length. And by the 19th century, these large fighting knives were more popular hand weapons than tomahawks. Tomahawks really did prevail in the 18th century, but by the time we're getting to the Plainsmen and to Texas, the Bowie knife is where people put their faith. In 1829, Stephen Austin authorized the Rangers to kill robbers, be them Indians or whites, and recover stolen horses, and do other such acts as your judgment may deem necessary to punish the robbers. And that document was the start of the official role of Rangers as both Indian fighters and as law enforcement officers. After winning independence in 1836, Texas President Mirabeau Lamar authorized the establishment of the 1st Frontier Battalion of Rangers. And he stipulated that each ranger was to equip himself with a good horse, a good rifle, and a pair of single-shot pistols. In 1841, something happened with the Texas Rangers that really did change history. I mean, it changed it for the world, for the firearms world at least. and it had a pretty heavy knock-on effect to all of society. In 1841, the Texas legislature reorganized the ranger companies. So this is something that the Texas legislature did constantly in the 19th century, usually because of money problems, of which they continuously had money problems. So they would cut back, and then things would get bad on the frontier, and they would, reestablish the Rangers or grow the Rangers. It just went back and forth seesawing. But in 1841, Captain Jack Coffee Hayes was appointed the head of the reorganized frontier force. And once again, the Ranger Authorization Bill said the Rangers were to provide their own horses, camp equipment, and arms. But when Captain Hayes was meeting with, at the time, Texas President Sam Houston, discussing equipping the Rangers, he learned that the Texas Navy, which had recently been decommissioned, had bought a supply of these, the Colt Patterson revolver. It's a 5-shot, 36 caliber revolver, had a folding trigger, unbelievably crude by our standards today, but it was pretty much the most technologically advanced sidearm of the time. So the Texas Navy had bought a bunch of these, and they were now in storage. They were in an armory. And Captain Jack Hayes wheedled out of Sam Houston a pair of these for each of his Rangers. And that ended up really changing the entire equation of firepower on the frontier. And it eventually led to the firearms that we have today. So it was very momentous. Captain Jack Hayes and his Rangers fairly quickly ended up in a fight using these Pattersons that became one of the most talked about, one of the most storied annals in Ranger history. And this fight goes by a variety of names, depending on who was telling about it. It's the Battle of Nueces Canyon, the fight at Guadalupe Crossing, the Battle of Pinta Trail Crossing, the Battle of Sister Creek, the Battle of Walker Creek, and Hayes' big fight on the Pedernales. But whatever name it goes by, here's what happened. In June of 1844, Captain Jack Hayes led a group of 14 Rangers on a scout looking for Indians. 2 days into the scout, they found Indian sign. They saw 4 Indians. And those Indians attempted to decoy Hayes into chasing them so they could lead him into an ambush where 75 Comanche were waiting. Hayes is an experienced Indian fighter at this time, and he did not take the bait. Now, Hayes instead circled behind the Comanche, drew up in a line, and charged straight at them. Hayes had his men fire their single-shot rifles, and then they dropped them to the ground and they drew their Pattersons. Now the Comanche expected the Rangers to only have single-shot weapons. They had no experience at all at this time with repeating arms. So they charged into the Rangers expecting them to be fighting now with Bowie knives. And as a result, the Rangers cut the Comanche to pieces. In 15 minutes, 20 Comanche were dead on the ground, and at least that many more were wounded. Every Ranger in the company ended up wounded as well, but they had driven the Comanche off, and in the process, they created a legend. In 1846, Texas Ranger Captain Samuel Walker's company was federalized as part of the volunteer U.S. cavalry in the United States Army going into the Mexican War. Now, when he knew his company was going to be called up for the Mexican War, Sam Walker, who had been with Jack Hayes at the big fight on the Pedernales, went to the Texas State Armory and scrounged up 40 Texas Pattersons, and he used them to equip his men. And the U.S. Army was so impressed by his men's performance with these revolvers that they actually ordered another 50 of them themselves, which by then Colt was out of business, but there were still some guns in storage, and they bought them all up. And they decided that they wanted more when they actually went into Mexico. So they got Sam Walker to go up to Washington, get authorization, and then go looking for Sam Colt and get some revolvers made, which Walker did. But Walker had his own ideas about what made a good fighting revolver. And he developed those ideas by actually fighting with revolvers. And that brings us to the next step in both the Colt story and the Texas Ranger story. You know, men who used the Patterson to fight knew its potential, but they also knew everything that was wrong with it. And when Sam Walker looked up Sam Colt, he was determined that the gun that Colt was going to produce, that he was going to have to fight with in Mexico, was going to be a better gun than the Patterson. And he sat down with Colt, and between them they designed this gun, which is the Walker Colt, often known as a model 1847 or the Walker. This was a 44 caliber 6-shot gun, where the Patterson was a 5-shot 36 caliber. It had a trigger guard. It had a loading lever, which some of the Pattersons did as well. It had a 9-inch barrel. It held a massive 60 grain powder charge. This gun could shoot as far and as hard as many of the rifles of the era. And that's what Walker wanted, because he wanted a gun that he could fight on horseback and not wait until the enemy was like spitting distance away from him before he could kill him with it. So he wanted a gun that would reach out there, but that would be portable, and he could arm each of his men with 2 of them, which would give them 12 shots going into the battle, which is just tremendous firepower compared to the single-shot rifles and pistols of the day. So he worked with Colt, and this is what they came up with. And the Army ordered 1,000 of them, which were delivered into Mexico, mostly to Texas Rangers, and they did amazing service there. Now, quite a few of them, at least 300 of them, blew up. And there's a variety of reasons for that, and one of the reasons is because they were using bullets instead of balls, and the bullets were not heel-based. So they were incredibly difficult to start, and a lot of guys ended up reversing them, putting the round nose in first so they could force it in, and that wad cutter hitting the forcing cone with a 60 grain charge behind it often built up too much pressure for the iron metallurgy of these guns, and they blew. But about 300 of them did, so 700 of them did not, and ended up going into storage after the war, and some of those made their way back to Texas. So this was never officially a Texas Ranger gun, though it was the most popular handgun made, and certainly the most popular standard issue handgun made, until Smith & Wesson's .357 Magnum revolver came out in the 1930s, and even then it was pretty close to the same power as this. Just an amazing weapon. Of course, the downside is 9-inch barrel, over 4 pounds in weight. There was no way you could carry this around, or it's very difficult. I mean, I've got belt holsters for it, but man, you know you're wearing a pair of boat anchors when you've got a couple of these strapped to your waist. Colt quickly abandoned this after making the first 1,000, and he came up with a new series of firearms that combined most of the power of the Walker with a bit more portability, and they were hugely successful. And of course, we're talking about the Dragoon series of revolvers. Also 44 caliber. Powder charge was cut down to about 40 grains of powder, which made for a much more reasonable charge. But they could still reach out there and touch someone. They were still big, heavy guns, but they were much more ergonomic, much easier to carry, though generally the horse did the carrying in pommel holsters. But we find Texas Rangers carrying these. The Texas Rangers were largely federalized for the rest of the 1840s. And they were often issued Dragoons by the U.S. government. In 1850, Sam Colt finalized his design for what was going to become one of the most iconic revolvers in American history. And significantly, Sam Colt designated this revolver the new Ranger-sized revolver. And he continued to have a soft spot in his heart for the Texas Rangers for the rest of his life, because he knew that they had saved his company and made him a fortune. Now, we know this gun better as the model 1851 Colt Navy revolver, a 36 caliber 6-shot revolver, just like the Patterson, except 6 shots, highly portable, well balanced, excellent loading lever. This one's a little stiff. And probably the best revolver grip in the history of revolvers. This gun pointed like it was an extension of your hand, shot a hard enough, powerful enough round to stop a fight. But you could carry a pair of these on your belt and not be distressed. Just absolutely a wonderful, wonderful weapon. And most people in Texas were carrying these within a few years. Now this is an original. Some of the high-end guns would have had a silver finish. This one looks like silver. It's actually chromed. It was chromed after the fact in the 19th century. You don't find many of them chromed. Or I shouldn't say chromed. It's nickeled, not chromed. The nickeling didn't come in until about 1875, so this was actually nickeled about 13 years after it was made. It was made in 1862. But this is the kind of gun you would have found in the 1850s. They would have looked a little more like this. Would have been blue with brass grip frames and a color case hardened frame. This is an Uberti replica, an excellent replica, I must say. Though I have to say, my original, I do shoot it. It shoots phenomenally well. It's got a great trigger, very accurate. So these were the guns to carry in the 1850s, and because Texas Rangers had to provide their own sidearms, most of them from the 1850s until the 1860s were carrying one of these, an 1851 Navy. In fact, these were so prevalent in Texas that I'm going to read you a quote. All right, so the Colt 1851 Navy quickly became the most popular sidearm in Texas. And landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted traveled the length and breadth of Texas in the mid-1850s. And Olmsted observed, for practical purposes, one Colt Navy revolver we found to be worth a dozen of all others. Such was the testimony of every old hunter and ranger that we met. There are probably in Texas about as many revolvers as there are male adults. And I doubt if there are 100 revolvers in this state of any other make than the Colt Navy. That is quite a powerful statement. In 1858, in response to a series of bloody Indian raids, Governor Hardin Richard Runnels ordered Texas Ranger Captain John Rip Ford to follow any and all trails of hostile or suspected hostile Indians you may discover, and if possible, overtake and chastise them. Now, when Ford's men headed out in February of 1858, each man provided his own mount and sidearms. Most of the men were armed with a pair of Colt Navy revolvers, and they were issued by the Texas government a .58 caliber model 1855 Springfield rifled musket. Captain Ford quickly found a party of 350 Comanche warriors commanded by Chief Ironshirt. And he was called Chief Ironshirt because he wore a shirt of chain mail that had been provided by the Spanish a couple of hundred years before and had been passed down from man to man as a sign of status. They met in battle at the Battle of Little Robe Creek. It lasted 6 hours. The Rangers killed 76 of the Comanche and they wounded many more. They took 60 prisoners, and they captured 400 horses. During that entire 6-hour battle, the Rangers suffered 2 dead and 3 wounded. That was a pretty impressive fight. Well, you know, we were just talking about the raids of 1858. and the big fight with the Comanche. And in fact, a lot of people don't realize that Texas was the bloodiest battleground state of the Indian Wars. From the late 1820s right up to the 1870s, the Texas frontier was under constant attack, mostly from Comanches, Kiowa, and Apache. Every year, hundreds of Texans were killed in Indian attacks, and hundreds more were taken into permanent captivity. Thousands of horses and cattle were stolen. It was a constant battle. And during the Civil War years, Texas lost any federal protection for its frontiers. Not that they ever considered that to be fantastic, but it was something. There was a federal string of forts. They were all abandoned when Texas joined the Confederacy. So Texans were left on their own, and they were the only Confederate state that had a true Indian frontier. So they had to support the Confederacy fighting the Union, and they had to protect their population at home. They were the only state that had to do that. So they authorized a new Texas Ranger Battalion, 10 companies be raised. And, of course, as always, they stipulated that the Rangers were to equip themselves for service, that each Ranger was to have a good Colt's pistol, an Army caliber. They would have a good single-shot rifle or shotgun suitable for use from horseback. They would equip themselves with a horse, saddle, and all camp equipage. Then go off and protect the frontier. Now, Texas had appointed Ben McCulloch to be colonel of their new Ranger regiment, and he was an experienced Ranger captain. But Ben had other ideas. He wanted to fight in the East with the armies of the Confederacy. He wanted to lead Texas forces against the Union forces. He did not want to stay back and guard the frontier. So he had his brother Henry McCulloch appointed as the colonel of the Texas Ranger Regiment while he went off. But what he did is tried to secure arms for the new Texas Ranger Regiment, because Ben McCulloch knew Sam Colt very well. He was one of the advisors to Colt from the Texas Rangers, and he had known him for years. So when he left Texas, he made his way up to see Sam Colt, and he convinced Colt to sell him 1,000 of the new 1860 Army revolvers. Now, that was technically illegal. Colt could not sell revolvers to the state of Texas, to any of the seceding states. So what he did to get around that is he sold 1,000 of these guns to Ben McCulloch personally as a private citizen. Now, Ben didn't have any money, and in fact the state of Texas didn't have any money, but Colt still gave him the guns, and Ben arranged for them to be smuggled into the state of Texas to be used by the Rangers. Now, Ben had convinced Colt that these guns were not going to see action with the Confederate Army, that they would only be used to guard the Texas frontier from Indian attack. And like I said, Colt always had a soft spot in his heart for the Texas Rangers, and there was no way that he was going to leave them to their fate. So 1,000 of these made their way to Henry McCulloch. Now, these guns had the fully fluted cylinder. This is a sign of the earliest production of the model 1860 Army revolver. And this is not an original, unfortunately, but it is a Colt. This is a third generation Colt. Now, with the originals, unfortunately, a number of these blew up because, as it turned out, even with the improved steel that Colt was using to make the 1860 Army, taking that much meat off of the cylinder was just too much. So there was definitely a problem with these. But still, enough of them survived on the frontier to equip McCulloch's regiment, and Colt 1860 Armies were one of the mainstays of guarding the frontier during the Civil War. In addition to the guns that Ben McCulloch brought in, the state of Texas managed to get some other 1860s during the Civil War. Not from Colt, but a lot of these were picked up on the battlefield, and some of them got funneled back to the Texas Rangers. After the war, the Texas Rangers were disbanded during Reconstruction. But a lot of them actually were federalized into federal service as volunteer cavalry, still patrolling the frontier, but not under the aegis of the state of Texas. And a lot of them were equipped with Colt 1860 Armies in that period. And in fact, this is an original Colt 1860 Army of the type that would have been prevalent on the Texas frontier at that time. Now, these were dark days in Texas, without a doubt. Reconstruction was not a good time. And I'm going to end part 1 here. We're going to pick up part 2 in 1870, immediately after Reconstruction, and in one of the most interesting eras of the Texas Rangers that ever there was. So I hope that you will stay tuned for that. And if you're wondering, by the way, what happened with that bill for 1,000 Colts that Ben McCulloch was carrying around, it was never paid. And Colt carried that as an account receivable for about 15 years, and then they just quietly took it as a loss in the 1870s, and nothing was ever said of it. So, I really hope you enjoyed this video. I enjoyed making it. And if you did, you know, thumbs up, right? We like that. By all means, send me a comment whether you liked it or you didn't. I always like to know what you heard about this. And stay tuned for number 2, because number 2 is going to cover some of the guns that we consider to be most iconic to the Texas Rangers. The Sharps carbine, the Winchester carbines, and the Colt Single Action Army, among others, are going to make their appearance in part 2. So, until next week, bye.